The room went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that happens when someone drops a glass or trips on a rug. This was the kind of quiet that only happens when something so unexpected walks through a door that every single person in the room forgets what they were saying mid-sentence. Crystal chandeliers hanging 40 feet above the marble floor seemed to stop swaying. The jazz quartet in the corner lost their rhythm for exactly 3 seconds. 200 of the wealthiest people in the state of Virginia turned their heads at the exact same moment toward the grand entrance of Hartwell Manor, and every single one of them stared. She stood in the doorway like she had been dropped there from another world. Her dress was clean, but it was the kind of clean that comes from scrubbing something too many times. The fabric thin at the elbows, the hem slightly uneven like someone had fixed it with a needle and thread by lamplight. Her hair was pulled back simply, no jewels, no pins, nothing fancy. Her face was sunburned across the nose and cheeks in a way that no woman at this party would ever allow. And her shoes, those shoes, they were the thing that broke the silence. The left one had a crack running all the way across the sole so deep that when she walked, the front of the shoe actually flapped slightly, making a soft slapping sound against the marble floor of the foyer with every single step she took. The right one had the heel held on by what appeared to be electrical tape, dark gray and wrapped thick like someone had really tried to make a hold. The leather on both shoes was cracked and white at the stress points, scuffed beyond any reasonable hope of polish, and they were at least 2 sizes too big, stuffed at the toe with what looked like folded newspaper peeking out at the front edge. She walked through the door of the most expensive private residence in the entire Commonwealth of Virginia, wearing shoes that looked like they had survived a war, and she walked like she owned the place. Not arrogantly, not with attitude. She walked with the quiet certainty of someone who had already survived the worst part of whatever story she was living. And this room full of people in tuxedos and gowns and diamonds was simply the next step she had to take. Her chin was up. Her shoulders were back. Her eyes were scanning the room with calm focus, not nervousness, not wonder, not intimidation. She was looking for someone. That was when he saw her. Marcus Hartwell III was standing near the fireplace with a glass of 30-year-old scotch in his right hand and 3 of his closest business partners hanging on his left side, laughing at something he had just said. He was 44 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, with dark hair going silver at the temples in that way that made the society pages describe him as distinguished every single time they printed his photograph. He was wearing a custom suit that cost more than most families in the county spent on groceries in a year. His watch alone could have paid a teacher's salary. He was the kind of man who had never in his adult life been surprised by anything, because he had enough money to simply eliminate surprises from his existence. He looked at her shoes first. That was the thing about Marcus Hartwell. He always noticed details, and he noticed them in the wrong order. He saw the cracked sole. He saw the electrical tape. He saw the newspaper stuffed in the toe. And before his brain had even processed a face above those shoes, before he had registered the exhaustion in her posture, or the determination in her eyes, or the thing she was holding carefully against her chest with both hands, his mouth was already moving. He said it loudly enough for the 6 people nearest to him to hear. He said it with the casual amusement of a man who has never once considered that his words might land on someone like a physical blow. He said, and these were his exact words, that someone had clearly taken a wrong turn on their way to the thrift store. The laughter from his circle was immediate and sharp. She stopped walking. For exactly 2 seconds she stood completely still in the middle of that marble floor, those broken shoes silent for the first time since she had walked through the door, and she looked at him, not with anger, not with tears. She looked at him with an expression that was somehow worse than both of those things combined. The expression of someone who had expected exactly this and had come anyway, because what she was carrying was more important than her dignity. Then she reached into the worn cloth bag hanging from her shoulder, and she pulled out a watch. Not just any watch. It was a Patek Philippe Nautilus in rose gold, the limited edition from 2019, one of only 12 made in that configuration, and Marcus Hartwell had reported it stolen 14 months ago to the tune of $420,000. It had been on his wrist the night of the car accident on Route 9 near the Shenandoah Valley, and when he had woken up in the hospital, it was gone, and he had assumed it had been taken from him while he was unconscious, and his insurance company had paid out, and he had filed a police report, and he had thought about that watch exactly the way you think about something precious that the world has simply swallowed. She held out toward him across the distance of the room, her arm extended, her hand steady despite everything. And she said in a voice that carried perfectly through the now absolutely silent ballroom that she believed this belonged to him, and that she was sorry it took her so long. And that was a moment that every single person in that room understood that something extraordinary was happening, and none of them, not one single person in that room of 200 wealthy and educated and well-traveled people, had any idea yet what it was. If this story already has your heart beating faster, then you are exactly where you are supposed to be right now, because what is about to unfold over the next several hours is going to take everything you think you know about sacrifice and pride and love and turn it completely inside out. Before this story goes one single step further, if you're watching this on YouTube right now, please take 5 seconds and hit that subscribe button below this video, because this channel exists to tell stories exactly like this one. Stories about ordinary people who do extraordinary things when nobody is watching, and we never want you to miss a single one. Share this video with someone you love, someone who needs to be reminded that real courage still exists in this world, and drop a comment below telling us what you think is in her story, because you do not know yet, not even close, and when you find out, you're going to want to talk about it. Now, back to her. Her name was Callie Marsh, and she was 38 years old, and she had walked, not driven, not ridden, not taken a bus. She had walked on her own 2 feet, in those shoes, over the course of 11 days, covering ground from a small town called Denton Falls in the western part of Virginia, all the way to the Hartwell estate outside of Charlottesville, which by the road she had to take, because she had no car and no money for a bus, measured out to 94 miles. She had not done it for money. She had not done it for a reward. She had done it because her mother had raised her to believe that what belongs to someone else belongs to someone else. Full stop. No exceptions. No matter what it costs you. No matter how convenient it will be looked the other way. No matter how different that person is from you, or how little they would ever do the same for you in return. Callie Marsh had grown up in Denton Falls in a house with 3 rooms and a leaky roof and a mother who worked 2 jobs and still somehow had dinner on the table every single night and still somehow found the time to sit with Callie at the kitchen table after dinner and read to her. And the thing her mother read most often, from a small worn paperback that had belonged to her own mother before her, was a collection of old stories about people who did the right thing when the wrong thing was easier. And those stories had gone into Callie the way water goes into dry ground, deep and permanent, all the way down to something that could not be washed back out. Her mother had died 4 years ago. Callie had been with her at the end, holding her hand in the hospital bed, and the last thing her mother had said to her, the absolute last words, were not "I love you," though that was understood, and were not "be happy," though that was hoped for, but were simply, "keep being good, baby. The world needs it more than you know." Callie had been keeping that promise ever since in the only way she knew how, which was to wake up every single day and do the small right thing, and then the next small right thing, and then the one after that, even when the right thing was hard, even when no one would ever know, even when the cost was something she could not really afford to pay. The watch had come to her almost by accident. She had been working the late shift at a diner, called Patty's off Route 9, the kind of diner that smells like coffee and maple syrup at all hours and has a jukebox in the corner that still plays Johnny Cash if you put in a quarter, and had been a Tuesday night 14 months ago, cold enough that the windows fog up at the edges, and the diner had been empty except for Callie and the cook, whose name was Gerald and who was 60 years old and had worked at Patty's for 31 years and could make a piece of apple pie that would make you close your eyes. At 11:47 at night, the door had opened and a man had come in. He had not come the way people usually come in, with a little bell and a stomp of cold feet and a scan of the menu on the wall. He had come in sideways, half falling, catching himself on the doorframe, and when Callie had come around the counter, she had seen that there was a gash on his forehead, and his jacket was torn at the shoulder, and there was gravel embedded in the palm of his right hand. He was conscious, but barely. The kind of barely where someone is moving and making sounds, but not quite making sense yet. The kind of barely that comes right after something very bad has happened, and the shock is still running the body on autopilot. She had helped him to a booth. She had brought him water and then coffee and then a clean cloth from behind the counter, and she had cleaned the gravel out his palm herself, piece by piece, while Gerald called 911, because the cut on his head needed looking at by someone who knew more than a diner waitress. The man had been Marcus Hartwell, though she had not known that then. To her, He was just a hurt man on a cold night who needed help. While she was cleaning his hand, he had been drifting in and out of real consciousness, talking in that loose, unfocused way that people talk when their brain has taken a knock and the filters are all down, saying things that didn't connect, a name she didn't recognize, something about a bridge, something about his father, and then he had reached up and grabbed her wrist with his good hand with surprising strength for a man in his condition, and he had looked at her with those dark eyes, not quite focused, and he had said, "Don't let me lose it." And she had said, "Lose what?" And he had looked down at his wrist where there was no watch, and his face had done something painful, and then his eyes had closed. The ambulance had come 8 minutes later. The paramedics had taken him out on a stretcher. In the commotion, in the business of making sure he was stable and answering the paramedics' questions and getting out of the way, Callie had found the watch. It was on the floor of the booth, partially under the table, half hidden by the shadow of the bench seat, and she had picked it up because she had thought it was hers, just for a split second, before she had turned it over and seen that it was something extraordinary, something so far outside the world of anything she had ever held in her hand that she had not even fully understood what she was looking at. She had asked the paramedics whose man this was, and they had said they didn't know yet, still identifying him. And she had said she found something that belonged to him, and they had said bring it to hospital, and she had said she couldn't leave the diner. She was the only one on shift, and they had said bring it in the morning, and then they had taken him, and the ambulance doors had closed, and the taillights had gone red, and then gone away, and she had been standing alone in the parking lot of Patty's Diner on Route 9, holding a watch that cost more than she would earn in the next 15 years. She had gone back inside. She had put the watch in the zippered pocket of her purse, the deep one, the one she never used, and she had zipped it shut, and she had gone back to work. In the morning, she had gone to the hospital. She had asked the man who had been brought in from Route 9 the night before head injury, and the nurse at the desk had said the patient had been moved to a private facility in Charlottesville and had been discharged. And Callie had said she had something that belonged to him, and the nurse had said she was very sorry, but she could not release patient information. And Callie had said she understood, and she had gone home. That had been the beginning of 14 months of trying. She had filed a found property report with the county sheriff's office, with a detailed description of the watch, where she had found it, when she had found it, everything she knew about the man who had left it. The deputy who had taken her report had been polite, and had filed it and told her someone would be in touch. No one had ever been in touch. She had gone back to the hospital twice more and been told the same thing both times in slightly different words. She had described the watch to a jeweler in Denton Falls, the only jewelry store in town, an old man who had been in business for 40 years, and he had gone very still when she described it, and then he had said very carefully that she should be extremely cautious, that a watch like that would be reported stolen, that she needed to be very careful about how she handled the situation. And something in the way he said it made her feel for the first time like she might be in some kind of trouble she had not asked for and did not understand. She had talked to a lawyer, the only one in Denton Falls, who worked out of an office above the hardware store and handled mostly wills and property disputes. And he had looked up Marcus Hartwell online while she sat across from his desk, and the color of his face had changed slightly when the search results loaded, and he had said, "Well now," and then he had told her that what she was holding was reported stolen, and that the right thing to do was to contact the Hartwell estate directly and return it and make sure she had documentation of the return, so that there could be no question about her own innocence in the matter. She had written a letter to the Hartwell estate. She had written it carefully on the nicest paper she owned, a small pad she had bought at the drugstore, and she had explained who she was and where she worked and what she had found and where she had found it and the date and the circumstances, everything, every single detail, and she had asked for a safe way to return the watch. The letter had come back 3 weeks later, unopened, with a stamped message on the envelope that said return to sender, recipient address insufficient for delivery. She had gotten the right address from the county records office and written again. That letter had not come back, but neither had any response. She had called the main number listed for Hartwell Industries, which was the only phone number she could find publicly connected to Marcus Hartwell, and she had navigated an automated system for 11 minutes before reaching a human being, a young woman who had been professionally pleasant and professionally impenetrable and had taken Callie's name and number and said someone would return her call within 5 to 7 business days. No one had returned her call. She called back, and called back again. She had gotten different human beings each time, all of them professionally pleasant, all of them taking her name and number, none of them ever calling her back. She had tried to reach Marcus Hartwell through his company's social media accounts and received automated responses each time. She had tried to find a personal contact, an assistant, a family member, anyone who might actually carry a message to the man himself, and found nothing she could actually use. And through all of this, through 14 months of trying, the watch had sat in that zippered pocket of her purse, and she had checked it every single day, just to make sure it was still there, and every single day the weight of it had pressed a little heavier on something inside her chest, because the watch was not hers, and she knew it was not hers, and she could not rest right while she still had something in her possession that belonged to someone else. That was the thing about Callie Marsh that most people who looked at her would never have guessed from the outside. She was not someone who was at peace easily. She looked calm. She looked steady. She looked like someone who had made a permanent agreement with the difficulty of her life and had stopped fighting it. But inside, in the place where her mother's voice still lived, she was someone who lay awake at night cataloging every small wrong thing she had done or allowed to happen, every obligation she had not yet met, every promise she was still carrying. The watch was the heaviest thing on that list. It had been the heaviest thing on that list for 14 months. And she had decided, after the last unanswered phone call, that the mountain would not come to her. She would walk to the mountain. Literally. She had no car. Her savings, at that moment, after her rent and her utilities and her groceries and the small amount she put aside every month toward a future that still felt very theoretical, totaled $412. A bus from Denton Falls to Charlottesville and back would have cost her $68, which she had. But she had also needed those $68 for the rent shortfall she was going to have in 3 weeks when her hours at the diner got cut because summer was ending and the tourists who drove Route 9 in warm, whether we're going home in Patty's business, always dropped in September. So she had mapped the route on the library computer. 94 miles by road. She had looked at it for a long time. Then she had gone home and found the best shoes she owned, which were the black ones with the electrical tape on the heel that she wore to work, because the non-slip soles were still good, even if everything else about them had given up. And she had packed a small bag with 3 days of food she had bought at the discount grocery, 2 changes of clothes, a water bottle, her phone charger, the watch in its zippered pocket, the letter she had written to Marcus Hartwell, so she would have documentation, and her mother's small worn paperback of stories. She had started walking on a Monday morning before sunrise, 11 days later, in the shoes that had gotten progressively worse with every mile. She had walked through the door of a party she had not been invited to at a manor she had never seen before, because the Hartwell estate had been lit up like daylight from a quarter-mile away when she had arrived at the gate that evening, and the gate had been open for the guests who were still arriving, and she had simply walked through it because she had come too far to be stopped by a gate, and none of the arriving guests had looked at her long enough to question whether she belonged, and she had followed the lights to the door, and she had walked in, and Marcus Hartwell had looked at her shoes and made a joke, and she had held out his watch, and the room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something true and large has just walked into the middle of them. Marcus Hartwell had not moved. In 22 years of building his fortune, in boardrooms and courtrooms and negotiating tables around the world, he had trained himself to respond to surprise with absolute stillness, because stillness looked like control, and control was a currency he had built his entire life on. But the stillness he was standing in right now was not the trained kind. It was the kind that happens to the body when the mind has encountered something it has absolutely no prepared response for. He was looking at his watch. He was looking at it the way you look at something you had given up on, the way you look at something you had grieved and filed away in the part of your memory reserved for permanent losses, the way you look at something that should not be here and is here anyway. His business partner to his left, a man named Douglas Fenn, who was 50 years old and had known Marcus since their MBA program at Wharton, and had therefore seen Marcus Hartwell surprised approximately twice in 20 years, was watching his face with the intense focus of a man watching something historical happen in real time. Marcus set his scotch down on the mantelpiece without looking at it. He walked toward her. The crowd parted for him the way crowds part from Marcus Hartwell, automatically, without him having to ask, because there was something in the way he moved through a space that communicated, without words, that the space belonged to him, and everyone else was a guest in it. He walked the 30 feet between them in about 8 steps, and then he stopped in front of her, and he was close enough now to see the exhaustion in her face properly, not just a sunburn, but the deep kind, the kind that lives in the eyes, the kind that does not come from one bad night, but from something much longer. He took the watch from her outstretched hand. He turned it over, on the back, where the custom engraving was. His father's initials and the date his father had given him this watch on the day Marcus had signed the papers that took Hartwell Industries from a regional construction company to a national enterprise. He ran his thumb across the letters, and he felt something happen in his chest that he did not entirely have words for. He looked up at her. He said, "Where did you find this?" She told him. Route 9, Patty's Diner. 14 months ago. Tuesday night, late. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, and she could see him doing the math, going back in his own memory to that night. The thing he had tried very hard to think about as little as possible, because it had been one of the worst nights of his life. Not because of the accident, which had been minor in the physical sense, a tire blowout that had sent his car off the road and into a drainage ditch, but because of what the accident had interrupted, what he had been driving away from when it happened, the conversation with his brother that had ended in the kind of silence that means something permanent has broken. He said, "You found this at the diner." She said yes. He said, "That was 14 months ago." She said yes. He said, "How long have you been trying to return it?" She said, 14 months. He said, nothing for a moment. Then he said, "And how did you get here tonight?" She said she walked. He thought she meant she had parked somewhere and walked up the driveway. He said, "From where?" She said, "Denton Falls." He knew where Denton Falls was. He had driven route 9 more times than he could count. He knew exactly how far Denton Falls was from where they were standing. He said, "You walked from Denton Falls." She said yes. He said, "When?" She said she had started 11 days ago. The room was still very quiet. Someone near the back, a woman in a green dress, had put her hand over her mouth. Marcus Hartwell was not a man who showed emotion easily or often. He had been raised by a father who considered emotional display a form of weakness, a father who had shaken his hand, not hugged him, at his college graduation, who had told him on the day of his mother's funeral that grief was a private matter and should stay that way, who had handed him the watch on the day of the business milestone and said only, "Don't lose it," and walked away. The watch was the most emotional gesture his father had ever made toward him, and it had been delivered in 4 words and a turn back. Marcus had inherited this quality along with the business. He was known in his industry as someone who did not flinch, who did not bend, who did not feel things in public, and quite possibly not in private either, and for the most part this reputation was accurate. But standing in front of this woman in her broken shoes, holding his father's watch in his hand, doing the math on what she had just said, something was happening behind his eyes that Douglas Fenn, watching from 20 feet away, had never seen there before. Marcus said, "You walked 94 miles to return a watch." She said, "Your watch?" He said, "Why?" She looked at him with that calm steadiness that had nothing to do with ease and everything to do with a decision she had made a very long time ago about who she was going to be in this world regardless of what the world did in return. And she said, "Because it's yours." 3 words. Because it's yours. Not because she expected a reward. Not because she thought he deserved it. Not because she needed something from him. Because it was his, and having it when it wasn't hers was something she could not live with. And so she had done what was necessary to fix that, and the distance had been what the distance was, and the shoes had held up well enough, and that was the whole story. Or at least, that was the whole story as she intended to tell it tonight. The real story, the long story, the story underneath the story, was something she had not yet told anyone. Marcus Hartwell stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, with a directness that surprised even himself, that she looked like she needed to sit down. She said she was fine. He said he could see that she was not entirely fine. She said she had walked 94 miles in 11 days, and she was still standing, and she was fine. Something moved through his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. He said, "Fair enough." Then he said, and his voice had changed, dropped a register, lost the performance of it, come down to something that was just one person talking to another person. He said he was sorry about the comment he had made when she came in. She looked at him steadily and said nothing. He said he meant it. She said she had heard worse. He said that was not actually a comfort. She said she knew that. For a moment neither of them spoke, and the 200 people in that room held very, very still. Then she reached into her bag again and pulled out a folded piece of paper and held out to him and said she would also need him to sign this, if he didn't mind, just for her records, confirming that she had returned the watch to him, with a date, so that there was no question about the timeline. He took the paper. He unfolded it. It was not the letter she had written to his estate. That was the back side, the copy she had kept for herself. On the front side, in careful plain handwriting, she had written out a simple statement of return, 3 sentences, the facts only, who she was, what she had found, what she was returning, and a line for his signature and the date. He read it twice. He looked up at her. He said, "You wrote this so you could prove you weren't a thief." She said, "I wrote it so I could sleep." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he took the pen from his jacket pocket, and he signed it. He handed it back to her. She folded it carefully and put it back in her bag. And then she said, very quietly, that she hoped the rest of his evening was good, and she turned to leave. He said her name. Not her name exactly, because he did not know her name. So he said, "Wait." She stopped. He said, "I don't know your name." She told him. He said her name once, quietly, like he was placing it somewhere. He said, "Callie." He said, "You walked 11 days to bring me this watch, and now you're going to turn around and walk home." She said she had planned to find somewhere to sleep tonight and start back in the morning. He said somewhere to sleep like she had a hotel reservation. She did not have a hotel reservation. He could see that. He looked at her for a moment. This woman who had walked 94 miles in broken shoes to do the right thing for a man who had not even had the grace to return her phone calls. And he said, "Please stay." She said, "I wasn't invited." He said, "I'm inviting you now." She looked around at the 200 people who were still watching this conversation with the focused attention of people watching something they know they will be describing to others for years. She said she was not really dressed for the occasion. He said that was the least important thing in the room right now. She looked at him. He looked at her. And somewhere in that house, the jazz quartet found their rhythm again. She stayed. She did not eat from the fancy past appetizers on silver trays. Not at first. Not until he personally put a plate in front of her and said, "Please, I'm asking." And she ate because she had not had a real meal in 3 days and her body had reached the point of overruling her pride. She sat in a chair near the edge of the room, slightly removed from the main conversation, and he sat beside her, and around them the party continued with a careful, very deliberate pretense of normalcy, while every person at that party found a reason to drift close to their corner at least once in the next hour. He asked her questions. Not the questions she expected, not the practical logistics questions about how exactly she had managed the trip, though those came later. He asked her first about the diner. He said, "You were working the late shift alone." She said she and Gerald, the cook. He said, "How long have you worked there?" She said, 11 years. He said, "Same diner, 11 years. She said, "Same diner, same shift, same corner booth where she kept her bag on the counter." He said, "You like it?" She thought about this for a moment, and then she said, "I like the people." He said, "What kind of people come to a diner on Route 9 at 11 at night?" She said, "All kinds. Truckers mostly. Some hunters in season. Families who've been driving too long. People who need somewhere to be that isn't home yet." He said, "People like me." She said, "I didn't know who you were that night." He said he knew. He said, "That's the reason you helped me. You didn't know who I was." She said she would have helped him either way. He said, "I believe you." She looked at him sideways. She said, "You don't know me." He said, "No, but I believe you anyway." She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she ate a small piece of bread and looked across the room at the jazz quartet, who were now playing something slow and complicated. He told her about the accident. He didn't have to. She didn't ask, but he told her, in the clipped, abbreviated way that people tell stories they have only half processed, about the blowout, about the ditch, about walking along the road in the dark until he saw the lights of Patty's, about the fact that he had been driving faster than he should have been because he had needed to get away from something before he said things he could not take back. She said, "The thing with your brother." He went very still. He said, "What?" She said, "You mentioned a bridge and you mentioned your brother while I was cleaning your hand. I didn't understand it then. I just remembered it." He was quiet for a long moment. He said, I don't usually talk about that. She said, you didn't usually. Your filters were off. He almost smiled again. He said, James. His name is James. We haven't spoken in 9 months. She said, because of that night. He said, because of things that have been building since before that night. And that night was just when they finally broke through the surface. She said, I'm sorry. He said, why are you sorry? You didn't cause it. She said, I'm sorry because having a brother and not speaking to him is a specific kind of loss that doesn't go away. And I'm sorry you're carrying it. He looked at her. She was looking at her plate. He said, do you have a brother? She said, no, I was an only child. He said, then how do you know what that loss feels like? She said, because I've watched enough people carry it to know what it looks like on a face. She looked up at him then. She said, it looks like what your face did when you were talking about him just now. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, you're very direct. She said, I've been walking for 11 days and I'm tired. I don't have the energy for anything else. This time he did smile. Not the polished, public smile that appeared in press photographs. Not the sharp, controlled smile he used in boardrooms when he wanted someone to feel at ease right before he took something from them. A different smile, smaller and slower, and connected to something that was actually happening inside him rather than something he was performing. Douglas Fenn, watching from across the room with a second glass of wine and the expression of someone watching a documentary unfold in real time, turned to his wife beside him and said very quietly that he had never seen Marcus look a person like that in the entire 22 years he had known him. His wife said, like, what? Douglas said, like he was actually listening. The party wound down around midnight. Guests said their goodbyes with the extended, lingering quality of people who feel they are being dismissed from something they want to keep watching. Douglas Fenn shook Marcus's hand on the way out and leaned in and said something very quietly that made Marcus give him a look that was not quite a glare, and Douglas smiled and walked away. The staff moved through the room quietly, collecting glasses, dismantling the floral arrangements, restoring the marble floors to their normal state. Callie had stood up at 11:30 and said she needed to find somewhere to sleep tonight. Marcus said, there are 14 guest rooms in this house. She said, that's not appropriate. He said, you walked 94 miles to return my watch. The least I can do is offer you a bed. She said, you already fed me. He said, you were hungry. She said, I was. He said, please stay. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, why? He said, because I have questions I haven't asked yet. She said, what kind of questions? He said, the kind I want to ask before you walk out of this room, and I never see you again, which is what's going to happen if you leave tonight, and I find that I am not ready for that. She looked at him with that direct, steady, no-nonsense gaze. She said, you just met me. He said, I know. She said, I'm a waitress from a small town who walked into your party in broken shoes. He said, I know. She said, I'm not what you usually, and she paused, looking for the word. She said, I'm not what usually interests you. He said, no, you're not. He said, that's exactly why I'm asking. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said one night she would stay one night in a guest room with a door that locked, and in the morning she would start back. He said, all right. He said, and the questions. She said, all right, and the questions. He nodded once, formal, like an agreement had been struck. She said, I need to ask you one thing first. He said, yes. She said, the comment you made when I walked in, the joke about the thrift store, is that who you are, or is that who you were tonight in front of those people? The question landed on him fully, and he did not deflect it. He said, I think that was who I am when I'm performing, when I'm being the version of myself that these gatherings require. He said, I don't know anymore if that version and the real version are different things. I've been performing for a long time. She said, that's an honest answer. He said, I thought you deserved one. She said, people usually think I deserve less. He said, then people are wrong. She looked away from him, out the tall windows of the dark ground of the estate, the lights strung in the trees along the drive, the fountain that was still running silver in the dark. She said, quietly, almost to herself, that she had not expected tonight to go like this. He said, how did you expect it to go? She said, I expected to hand you the watch, get your signature, and walk back out. He said, and instead, she said, And instead, I'm sitting in the most expensive room I have ever been in, and someone is asking me to stay. She said, "It's a lot." He said, "I know." He said, "I'll have Mrs. Aldridge show you to a room." He said, "And Callie." She looked at him. He said, "For what it's worth, I'm glad your shoes are terrible. Otherwise, I might have kept performing and missed the whole thing." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I'm not a thing you get to not miss." He said, "No, you're not." He said it like he meant it. She said goodnight and followed the housekeeper down the hall. And Marcus Hartwell stood alone in the empty ballroom for a long time, his father's watch in his closed fist, thinking about bridges. She did not sleep easily. The bed was the most comfortable thing she had ever lain in, which under normal circumstances would have been a pure pleasure, and under current circumstances was slightly disorienting, like sleeping inside someone else's life. The sheets were a thread count she had no reference point for. The room had a fireplace with a small fire that Mrs. Aldridge had lit before leaving, and the light of it moved slowly across the ceiling in a way that was deeply calming to look at. But her mind was not calm. She lay in the dark, and she thought about the things she had not said tonight. The things she had not said were significant. The story she had told, the simple version, the true but incomplete version, was this. She had found his watch. She had tried to return it. She had eventually walked it to him herself. The story she had not told was this. 3 months after finding the watch, when it had become clear that the official channels were not going to work, and she was beginning to understand the scale of what she was dealing with, not just the financial scale, though that was daunting enough, but the scale of the person himself, Callie had done something she almost never did. She had looked him up. She had gone to the library and used a computer there, and she had read about Marcus Hartwell with the careful attention she gave anything she needed to understand fully. She had read about the business, which was large and complex, and had made him one of the wealthiest men in the state. She had read about the philanthropy, which was real, but also clearly strategic, the kind of giving that came with naming rights and press releases. She had read about his personal life, which the press covered with the energy they always brought to wealthy, unmarried men of a certain age, the relationships that lasted 6 to 8 months and ended with mutual statements about busy schedules, the charity galas and the board memberships and the vacation photographs from places she would never be able to afford. And she had read, in a 2-year-old profile in a Richmond magazine, a single paragraph about the accident on Route 9. The accident had not been a major story. It had been mentioned almost in passing, as a footnote to a larger piece about Marcus's philanthropy in the Shenandoah Valley region. The writer had noted that Marcus had been involved in a minor vehicle accident on Route 9 the previous year, had been treated and released, no other vehicles involved, and had subsequently made a significant donation to the volunteer fire department that had responded to the scene. The donation had been substantial. The fire department that had responded was the Denton Falls Volunteer Fire Department. The Denton Falls Volunteer Fire Department, whose annual budget before the donation had been $43,000, had received, from Marcus Hartwell, a check for $220,000, which had allowed them to replace 2 aging trucks that had been held together for years by the mechanical ingenuity of volunteers, and the kind of prayer that asks specifically for engines to hold on just a little bit longer. Callie had sat in the library for a long time after reading that. She had thought about the fire captain, Tommy Briggs, who had been her neighbor growing up, who had come to her mother's funeral in his dress uniform, who coached Little League on Saturday mornings, who had been talking for years about those trucks. She had thought about the night of the accident. She had thought about the man she had helped in the booth, his hand in hers, the gravel she had picked out piece by piece, the water she had brought, the way he had looked when he realized the watch was gone. And she had thought about the fact that somewhere in the transaction of that night, whether consciously or unconsciously, something about that diner and that road and possibly that woman in it had stayed with Marcus Hartwell enough for him to send $220,000 to the fire department of the town where Patty's Diner sat. She had never told anyone this. She had not allowed herself to think too much about what it might mean, because thinking too much about what it meant was a road that led somewhere she was not prepared to go, a road that led toward feeling like she was owed something, or like there was a connection that was not really there, or like a single act of kindness in a diner booth at midnight had created some kind of bond between her life and his, which was the kind of thinking that led ordinary women in difficult circumstances to. build entire narratives around rich men who had already moved on and would not recognize them on the street. She had been very careful not to do that thinking. She had kept her focus entirely on the watch. The watch was real. The obligation was real. The donation to the fire department was a separate thing. His choice, nothing to do with her. That was the story she had kept to herself. Lying in the dark of his guest room, she was aware that the carefully maintained distance between those two things, the watch and the donation, was getting harder to maintain because he had looked at her in a way that made the distance feel dishonest. She fell asleep sometime after 2, with her bag on the floor beside the bed and her hand resting on the zippered pocket that was finally, for the first time in 14 months, empty. She was up before 6. She washed her face and changed into the last clean shirt in her bag and put on the shoes, which she had to do carefully because the left sole flapped more prominently now than it had yesterday, the crack having widened to the long walk up the driveway, and she had run out of tape 2 days ago. She went downstairs quietly, trying not to make noise in a house that felt differently weighted in the morning than it had the night before, smaller somehow, the grandeur of it reduced by early light to just a very large, very quiet collection of rooms. She was going to leave a note. She had decided this at some point in the night. She would leave a note, polite and simple, thanking him for the room and the food, wishing him well, and she would be gone before anyone was awake, because leaving in the daylight with people watching would require a kind of goodbye that she was not sure she was equipped for this morning. She was looking for paper in the kitchen when she found him. He was already there. He was standing at a large professional-grade stove in a plain white shirt, no jacket, no tie, the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he was making eggs, not directing someone else to make eggs, making them himself with focus, like it was something he did regularly and took seriously. He looked up when she came in. He said, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning." She said, "I was going to leave a note." He said, "I know. That's why I got up early." She looked at him. He said, "I had a feeling." She said, "How?" He said, "You seem like someone who leaves before it gets complicated." She said, "It's already complicated." He said, "Then you were going to leave anyway." She said, "Yes." He said, "Sit down. Have breakfast. Then leave if you want to." She considered him for a moment. This man in his rolled-up sleeves making eggs in a kitchen the size of her entire apartment. This man who 24 hours ago she had known only as a name she could not reach and a watch she could not return and a donation she had not been meant to know about. She sat down. He made eggs, scrambled soft the way that takes patience, and toast and coffee, and he put it in front of her and sat across from her with his own plate, and they ate in a quiet that was improbably comfortable. After a while she said, "You know how to cook." He said, "My mother taught me." He said, she believed that a man who couldn't feed himself was a man who had given away too much of his independence. She said, "She sounds smart." He said, She died when I was 26. She said, "I'm sorry." He said, "Your mother." She said, "For years ago." He said, "The stories." She looked at him. He said, "You mentioned last night, you started saying something about your mother, and then you stopped. Something about stories she read to you." She said, "I didn't think you were listening that closely." He said, "I was listening to everything." She looked down at her coffee. She said, she had a book, old paperback, looked like it had been read about 100 times. Stories about people who did the right thing when the wrong thing was easier. She read them to me at the kitchen table after dinner almost every night when I was small. He said, "And you believe them." She said, "I still believe them." He said, "Even after everything. After 11 days walking. After 14 months of phone calls that nobody returned." She said, "Especially after." He said, "Why especially after?" She said, "Because the alternative is deciding that doing the right thing only counts when it's convenient, and once you decide that, you can justify anything." He looked at her across the table. He said, "Most people would say that a reasonable person would have kept the watch." She said, "Maybe." He said, "A $400,000 watch, found by a woman making probably $12 an hour, who lives in a 3-room house and wears shoes held together with tape. Most people would say keeping it was not even wrong. It was survival." She said, "Most people would." He said, "But not you." She said, "Not me?" He said, "Why?" She said, because I would have known. 3 words again, because I would have known. He sat with that for a long time. He said, I think you might be the most unusual person I've ever met. She said, I think you met too many people who are all the same kind of person. He said, that's probably true. He said, I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, even if the honest answer is uncomfortable. She said, okay. He said, did you know about the donation to the Denton Falls Fire Department? The air in the kitchen changed. She looked at him carefully. She said, I found out about it when I researched you, to find your address. He said, when? She said, about 3 months after I found the watch. He said, so you've known for over a year. She said, yes. He said, and it didn't factor into your decision to return the watch. She said, no. He said, I won't believe that. She said, then believe it. He said, it would be human if it did. If some part of you felt that because of the donation you had some kind of connection to me that gave you a reason to come. She said, I had a reason to come. It was in the zippered pocket of my bag. He said, just the watch. She said, just the watch. He said, the donation. She said, the donation is between you and Tommy Briggs and the community that those trucks protect. It has nothing to do with me. He said, Tommy Briggs. She said, the fire captain. He was my neighbor growing up. He coached Little League. He cried at my mother's funeral. He looked at her. He said, you know him. She said, everyone in Denton Falls knows Tommy Briggs. He said, I never met him. I sent the donation through my foundation. She said, he talks about it still. He talks about it like it was a miracle that arrived without explanation. He said I should have explained. She said, why didn't you? He said, because explaining would have required thinking about that night, and that night was connected to other things I wasn't ready to think about. She said, your brother. He said, my brother. Silence. He said, his name is James, and he's 40 years old, and he builds furniture by hand in a workshop in Staunton, which is about 30 miles from where you live, and we have not spoken since the night of the accident, which was also the night of the conversation that ended with me saying something I cannot take back. She said, what did you say? He said, I told him he had wasted his life. The weight of that landed between them on the table. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, did you mean it? He said, I meant it the way you mean something when you are angry and afraid, and you want to hurt someone before they can hurt you. She said, afraid of what? He said, afraid that he was happy, and I wasn't. Afraid of the furniture and the small life and the workshop in Staunton. Afraid that all of it was actually something, that it added up to more than what I had, and I couldn't stand it. She said, so you told him he had wasted his life because you were afraid he hadn't. He looked at her. He said, I've never said that out loud before. She said, you knew it already. He said, yes. She said, then why haven't you called him? He said, I don't know how to take back a thing like that. She said, you say I was wrong and I'm sorry. He said, it's not that simple. She said, it mostly is. He said, he might not forgive me. She said, he might not. He said, then what? She said, then you'll have done the right thing anyway, and you'll know, and that will be something even if it's not everything. He looked at her for a long time. He said, the stories your mother read to you. She said, yes. He said, they went in deep. She said, all the way down. He asked her to stay another day. She said no. He asked her to let him drive her home. At least, she hesitated. He said, please, not as a favor to you. As something I need to do, because watching you walk out of this driveway in those shoes is not something I'm capable of doing without feeling like a person I don't want to be. She said, that's not my problem to solve for you. He said, I know. I'm asking anyway. She said, it's a long drive. He said, I have a car. She said, I know you have a car. He said, I'd like the time. She looked at him. She said, for the questions you haven't asked yet. He said, yes. She said, you know that driving me home doesn't change anything about what our lives are. He said, I know. She said, I'm still a waitress in a small town. You're still whatever you are. He said, I know what you are. I'm less sure about what I am. She picked up her bag. She said, all right, you can drive me home. He said, thank you. She said, don't thank me. You're doing me a favor. Remember, he said, right? She looked down at her shoes. She said, I'm going to need to get some tape at some point. The left one is getting worse. He said nothing for a moment. Then he went upstairs and came back down with a pair of plain white sneakers in her size, still in the box, the tags on. She stared at them. She said, "Where did those come from?" He said, "I asked Mrs. Aldridge this morning. She has a daughter who left some things here. Same size as you," she thought. She said, "I can't take someone's shoes." He said, "They've been in a closet for 2 years. Trust me." She looked at the shoes. She looked at her shoes. She said, "I'll pay her for them." He said, "They've been in a closet for 2 years." She said, "I'll pay her for them." He said, "Okay, fine." He said, $10. She said, "That seems low." He said, "Mrs. Aldridge is not going to take your money." She said, "Then why are we saying $10? He said, "Because you needed to pay something. So, $10. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You're strange." He said, "I've been told." She put on the new shoes. She picked up the old ones. He said she could leave them. She said she wasn't leaving them. He didn't ask why. He suspected he knew. They had carried her 94 miles. You don't leave behind something that has carried you that far. The drive was 4 hours. This was longer than the direct route should have taken. But he did not take the direct route. He drove slowly. And at some point he turned off the main highway onto Route 9, the actual road, and drove along in the direction of Denton Falls, the same road she had walked. She noticed. She said, "You're going a long way around." He said, "I know." She said, "Why?" He said, "I want to see it." She understood. They drove in silence for a while. He could see, on the right shoulder of the road in places, the evidence of someone having walked it recently. The way the gravel was disturbed in thin line, the way the grass at the edge was pressed down in a strip about shoulder width from the edge. It might have been anyone, but he knew it wasn't anyone. She was looking out the passenger window, and he could not see her face. He said, "You slept outside some nights." She said, 3 nights. The other nights I found places. A church that was unlocked. A roadside rest stop with a bathroom that was heated. A barn one night with a farmer's permission. He gave her dinner too. She said, "Soup and cornbread." He said, "What's his name?" She said, "Earl Duffy. About 62 miles from here, runs a cattle farm." He said, "I'd like to thank him." She said, "He wouldn't want thanks. He'd want you to know that he does it for everyone." She said, "He told me he'd never turn away a traveler in 40 years. He said, "Earl Duffy." She said, 62 miles. He said it quietly again, "Earl Duffy," and she knew he was going to remember it and do something about it, and she felt a complicated feeling about that, something warm and something cautious in equal parts. She said, "Marcus." It was the first time she had used his name. He noticed. He said, "Yes." She said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it correctly." He said, "Okay." She said, "What happened last night and this morning is real. The conversation is real. I'm not pretending it isn't something." He said, "Okay." She said, "But I've been very poor for a very long time, and I've watched what happens when people in my position let themselves want something from people in your position, and I'm not going to do that." He said, "I'm not asking you to want something from me." She said, "I know you're not. I'm telling you what I'm not going to do regardless of what you're asking." He said, "I hear you." She said, "Good." He said, "Can I tell you what I am asking?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I'm asking if we can keep talking. Just talking. Not a transaction. Not a negotiation. Not anything with an agenda. Just 2 people who keep talking." She said, "You live 4 hours away." He said, "I have a phone." She said, "I work nights." He said, "I'm awake at night." She said, "I'm not sure what this turns into." He said, "I'm not either. I don't think that should stop us." She looked out the window. Fields going by. October light on them, gold and thin. She said, "My mother would have had a lot to say about this." He said, "What would she say?" She said, "She would have said, 'Keep your feet on the ground and your heart open and see what happens.'" He said, "That sounds right." She said, "She would also have said, 'Make sure he knows what you're worth before he gets comfortable.'" He said, "What are you worth?" She said, "That's a conversation for another time." He said, "So there's another time." She almost smiled. She said, "Maybe." He said, I'll take maybe. They stopped at a gas station about 40 miles from Den Falls. He filled the tank, which she watched through the window with the slight discomfort of someone unaccustomed to being still while someone else does things. She got out and went inside and came back with 2 coffees in paper cups and a package of peanut butter crackers. She handed him one of the coffees. He said, "You bought me coffee." She said, "It's $2. Don't make a thing." He said, "I wasn't going to." She handed him the crackers. He said, "Are these for me?" She said, "They're for both of us. It's the same package." He opened the crackers and ate one. He said, "These are good." She said, "They're peanut butter crackers from a gas station." He said, "I haven't had gas station peanut butter crackers in probably 20 years. She said, "That's a long time ago without something good." He looked at her. She was eating a cracker and looking at the road. He thought about the last 20 years and what had been in them and what had been missing from them. And he thought about the cracker in his hand and the coffee and this woman who walked 94 miles because her mother had read her stories. And he thought about his brother James building furniture by hand in a workshop in Staunton, 30 miles from here, probably right now on a Wednesday morning, running his hand along a piece of wood that was becoming something under his hands. He said, "I need to make a call." She said, "Okay." He said, "While we're stopped." "Do you mind?" She said, "Go ahead." He walked a few steps away from the car, and he took out his phone, and he stood there for a moment with it in his hand. Then he dialed. It rang 4 times. A voice said, "Hello." Marcus said, "James." Silence. Then James said, "Marcus." Marcus said, "I was wrong. I'm sorry. I was wrong about what I said, and I was wrong to say it, and I've been wrong to not call for 9 months, and I'm sorry." Silence. Longer this time. Then James said, "Okay, that was all. Just okay." And Marcus understood that okay was not forgiveness, yet it was not resolution. It was not the return of the easy brotherly shorthand they had had before that night. But okay was a door left slightly open where before there had been nothing but a wall, and a door slightly open was everything. It was a whole world in the width of a crack. He said, "I'd like to come see the workshop sometime, if that's all right." James said, "Yeah." He said, "All right." James said, "Yeah, all right." Marcus said, "I'll call next week." James said, "Okay." They hung up. Marcus stood by the car for a moment. Then he got in. Callie was looking at him. He said, he answered. She said, "I know. I could hear from here." He said, "I said I was sorry." She said, "I know." He said, "Okay." She said, "That's a start." He said, "Yes." He said, "It's a start." He put the car in gear. He sat there for a second with his hands on the wheel, and she could see something moving through him. Something he didn't have words for yet. Something that was going to take a while to settle into whatever it was going to become. She reached over and put her hand over his on the wheel for just a second. Not romantically. Not with weight. Just there. Just present. The way you put your hand on something when you want someone to know that you see what it cost them. Then she took it back. He put the car in drive. They drove. Den Falls looked the way it always looked in mid-morning, which was quiet and worn and real. The kind of town that exists because people needed to exist, not because anyone designed it to be beautiful. He drove down Main Street slowly. She said, "Left on Cutter." Then 3rd right. He turned left on Cutter. Then 3rd right. Her street was called Aldine Road, and it was short and modest, and her house was a white clapboard with a small porch and 2 pots of late-season chrysanthemums on the steps that were still orange and alive. He parked. He looked at the house. She said 3 rooms and a leaky roof. He said, "It looks like a good house." She said, "It is a good house." She meant it. He could hear that she meant it. She opened the door. She said, "Thank you for the drive." He said, "Thank you for the watch." She almost laughed. She almost, finally, fully laughed. It was a small sound that she caught before it fully happened, but he heard it, and it went into him like something he had not known he was waiting for. She got out of the car. She went around to the trunk where her bag was. He got out too. He opened the trunk for her. She took her bag. She looked at him across the top of the car. He said, "I'm going to call you tomorrow." She said, "I work until 2. He said, 2 a.m. or 2 p.m. She said, a.m. He said, "So I'll call after 2. She said, "That's 3 in the morning." He said, "I know. I told you I was awake at night." She said, That's not a healthy habit. He said, I have a lot of unhealthy habits. This one I'm going to keep for a while. She looked at him. He looked at her. The October light was doing something particular to this street and this moment, and she was aware of it in the specific way you become aware of the quality of a moment when you sense it might be one of the ones you carry with you. She said, Marcus. He said, yes. She said, be careful driving back. He said, I will. She said, and call your brother next week. He said, I will. She said, good. She walked up the path to her door. She had her keys out before she reached the porch. She opened the door. She did not look back. She went inside. He stood beside his car on Aldine Road for a moment in the thin October light, holding absolutely nothing. Then he got in his car and drove away. She went to work that night. Gerald was at the stove. The jukebox had Johnny Cash. The windows fog at the edges. The coffee was on. Patty herself, who was 73 and still came in 3 mornings a week to do the books and drink 1 cup of coffee at the counter and talk to whoever was there, had heard something secondhand through the network of small-town information that flows through places like Denton Falls as naturally as water through channels. And she was sitting at the counter when Callie came in, and she looked at Callie for a long moment, and then she said, you gave it back. Callie said, I gave it back. Patty said, good girl. Callie said, Patty? Patty said, Callie said, I need to tell you something. Patty said, sit down then. Callie sat. She said, I think something happened. I'm not sure what it is yet, but I think something happened. Patty looked at her for a long time. Patty said, is it the good kind of something or the scary kind? Callie said, I think it might be both. Patty said, the best things usually are. Callie said, I don't know what I'm doing. Patty said, that's the most honest thing a person can say. Callie said, his world is not my world. Patty said, no. Callie said, I'm a waitress. Patty said, you're a person. The waitress is what you do right now. It is not what you are. Callie said, you sound like my mother. Patty said, your mother was a smart woman, and so am I. Now go clock in. We have a trucker coming in on the 11:30 who wants the meatloaf, and I already told him we'd have it. Callie clocked in. She worked the rest of the night the same way she always worked, with care and attention, and the full weight of her presence in every small transaction, the coffee refills and the check calculations and the small talk and the listening, because she had learned from her mother that all work done well is its own kind of dignity, that the size of the stage has nothing to do with the quality of performance. At 2:17 in the morning, her phone rang. She was in the break room with her shoes off. Sitting on the small couch with a cup of tea, she looked at the number. She answered. She said, you said after 2. He said, it is after 2. She said, by 17 minutes. He said, I've been sitting in my car outside for 15 of them. She said, outside where? He said, Patty's Diner. She went very still. She said, you drove back. He said, I got about 40 miles away and then I drove back. She said, why? He said, because I realized I forgot to ask the most important question. She said, what question? He said, can I come in? She said, the diner is open. Anyone can come in. He said, that's not what I mean and you know it. Silence. She said, Marcus. He said, yes. She said, I need you to understand something. He said, okay. She said, if you come in here, you have to come in here without an agenda, without a plan for what this looks like in 6 months, without any of the things you probably use to manage your life. He said, I know. She said, and if you come in here, I'm going to give you coffee in a chipped mug, and Gerald is going to look at you like he's trying to figure out what you're doing in his diner at 2 in the morning, and I'm probably going to go back to work in 10 minutes because Patty keeps a tight ship. He said, that sounds exactly right. She said, and you're okay with that? He said, I've been sitting outside for 15 minutes to ask if I can have coffee in a chipped mug. I think I'm okay with it. She almost laughed again. This time it came out. Not big, just real. He heard it. She said, come in. Then she heard the car door. She heard his footsteps on the gravel outside. She heard the bell above the diner door. She stood up and put her shoes back on and went out to the floor. He was standing in the doorway. Not a party doorway this time. A diner doorway. Fluorescent light behind him. The cold October air coming around him. The smell of coffee and maple syrup all around. He was wearing the same white shirt from this morning, still rolled to the elbows. Gerald looked at him from behind the grill with an expression that was exactly as described. Kelly said, "Booth 4, I'll get the coffee." He went to booth 4. He sat down. She brought the coffee in a chipped mug. She put it in front of him and sat down across from him in the same booth where she had cleaned his hand 14 months ago, in the same diner, on the same shift, and she looked at him across the table. He wrapped both hands around the mug. He said, "This is better." She said, "It's a diner." He said, "Yes." He said, "It's exactly right." Weeks passed. This is a part of the story that is often rushed over, the passage of ordinary time, the accumulation of small things, because stories are supposed to be about the large moments, the decisive ones, and ordinary time looks like nothing from the outside. But ordinary time is where everything actually happens. It is where two people find out if what they felt in the extraordinary moment is real, or only the feeling of the extraordinary moment itself. Marcus came to Patty's diner 6 more times in the next 4 weeks. He drove 4 hours each way. He always came in on her late shift. He always sat in booth 4. He always had the coffee in the chipped mug and whatever Gerald had made that night. And he was always polite to Gerald in the specific way of a man who is trying to be a person rather than persona, and Gerald remained suspicious for approximately 3 visits, and then one night made him a piece of apple pie without being asked and put in front of him, and walked back to the grill without saying a word, and Marcus ate the whole thing and said nothing either, and that was the beginning of Gerald's approval, which mattered to Callie more than she had expected it to. They talked on the phone on the nights he wasn't there. Long calls, the kind that go until 4 in the morning, and end only because someone has to be somewhere at a real time. He told her about his father, the hard version, not the polished version from profiles, the version where the love was real, but the expression of it had been so compressed by the man's own upbringing that it had come out mostly as demands and the occasional gesture too small for what it was trying to carry. She told him about her mother, the full version, the woman who had been tired almost always and joyful regularly anyway, who had read to her every night not because it was required, but because she understood instinctively that filling a child with stories was the same as filling a child with spine, a thing they would use forever to stay upright. He told her about James. He had called James a week after he said he would. James had answered. They had talked for 23 minutes. Not easily, not with everything repaired. But the door was open and there was light coming through it. And Marcus went a stunt on the second Saturday of November, and James showed him the workshop. He described the workshop to Callie on the phone that night. He said it smelled like sawdust and linseed oil, and it was warm from wood stove in the corner. And every surface had a project in some stage of becoming. And James had shown him a dining table he was building for a family in Harrisonburg, cherry wood, hand-jointed, and Marcus had run his hand along the edge and felt the exactness of it, the way it was made to last, and he had said, "This is beautiful, James." And James had looked at him with the face of a man who had been waiting years to hear his brother say that. And they had not hugged or cried or done anything that would make it into a movie, but something had shifted back into its correct position with a small, inaudible click. Callie had listened to all of this. When he was done, she said, "Good." He said, "Just good." She said, "I mean it with everything." "Good." He said, "I know you do." He said, "I told him about you." She said, "What did you tell him?" He said, "I told him about the watch and about the party, and about the drive back to Denton Falls, and about sitting outside the diner for 15 minutes. She said, "What did he say?" He said, "James said, she sounds like the kind of person who keeps people honest." She said, "Is that a compliment?" He said, "From James, it's the highest possible compliment. He doesn't have use for people who don't." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did you tell him about the donation?" He said, "Yes." She said, "What did he say?" He said, "James said, you did that because she made you feel something and you didn't know what to do with it, so you did the only thing you knew how to do." She said, "He's perceptive." He said, "He always was." I spent a long time being threatened by that. She said, "And now?" He said, "Now I'm just glad he's my brother." The first time he met her community was Thanksgiving. It was not planned as a meeting. He had asked, cautiously, in early November, whether she had plans for Thanksgiving, and she had said she was having people over, not many, just the people who were hers, and she had not invited him, but she had not invited him either, and he had said he would like to come if she would have him, and she had paused for a long time and then said, "Let me think about it." She thought about it for 5 days. Then she called him and said, "Tommy Briggs is going to be there. You should know that." He said, "The fire captain." She said, "Yes." He said, "The one the trucks went to." She said, "Yes." "He doesn't know that you were the donor. It was anonymous." He said, "I see." She said, "You're going to have to decide before you come whether you want that to stay that way or not." He said, "What do you think I should do?" She said, "I think you should come. I think whatever happens will be right." He said, "That's not a prescription." She said, "I don't get prescriptions. I'm not a doctor." He almost laughed. He came on Thanksgiving. He drove 4 hours and arrived with 2 pies from a bakery in Charlottesville and stood at the door of the small white house on Aldine Road. And she opened the door and looked at him and looked at the pies and said, "You brought 2 pies." He said, "I didn't know which kind you liked." She said, "I like both." He said, "Then it worked out." The house was warm and full of the kind of comfortable chaos of a small gathering of people who actually like each other. Patty was there, in an armchair by the window, and Gerald and his wife, a small round woman named Diane, who pulled Marcus into a hug within the first 90 seconds, as if she had been briefed and had decided. A woman named Carol from down the street, who had been Callie's mother's best friend. And Tommy Briggs, who was 58 and had a face like a man who had spent his whole life outdoors doing things that mattered, and who shook Marcus's hand with the directness of someone who knows his own worth. Dinner was at the table in the main room, which was also the living room, because the house had 3 rooms, and the table had been extended with a card table at one end and covered with 2 mismatched tablecloths. And the food on it was real food made by people who knew how to cook, because they cooked every day and meant it, and it was the best meal Marcus Hartwell had eaten in years. After dinner, when the dishes were done and people were sitting with their coffee and the remains of the pie, Tommy Briggs said something about the trucks. He was not talking to Marcus specifically. He was talking to the table. He was saying, as he apparently said regularly, that those trucks were a miracle, that the timing of the donation had been exact, that they had been one bad call away from losing the older truck to engine failure, that the year they had gotten the new ones had been the year of the brush fires along the northern ridge, and those trucks had been in that fight every single day. He said, "I've asked around for years. Try to find out who it was. No one knows." He said, "Whoever did it saved lives. I mean that in the most literal possible way. Whoever did it saved lives." Marcus was looking at his coffee mug. Callie was watching him from across the table. He looked up. He met Tommy's eyes. He said, "I'm glad the trucks were there when they were needed." Tommy Briggs went very still. He looked at Marcus for a long moment. He said, "Son." He said it quietly. He said, "Was it you?" Marcus said, "Yes." Tommy Briggs put his coffee mug down very carefully on the table. Then he stood up and he walked around the table, and he put his hand out, and Marcus stood up and took it, and Tommy Briggs shook his hand once and then held on to it and looked at him and said, "I don't know why you did it or how you knew we needed it, but thank you. Thank you. Those are people's kids who came home." Marcus said, "I know." Tommy said, "I don't know how you know, but I believe you." He let go of Marcus's hand. He sat back down. He picked up his coffee. The table was quiet for a moment. Then Patty said, "Well, that's a Thanksgiving story." And everyone laughed, and the tension broke into something warmer, and Gerald got up to cut the second pie. Callie looked at Marcus across the table. He looked back at her. She did not say anything. She did not have to. IT was the first week of December, when things got complicated. Not complicated between them. That complication was already a fact, and they were navigating it as honestly as 2 people from completely different worlds can navigate the specific dissonance of having found something real across an impossible distance. The complication came from outside. It came in the form of a photograph. Someone at the Thanksgiving gathering had taken a photograph, not maliciously, just the ordinary documentation of an ordinary evening. Someone's phone out on the table, someone capturing the group at dinner, and Marcus Hartwell was in it, and Callie was in it, and the photograph had made its way onto social media through someone's account and had been noticed by someone who recognized Marcus. And within 48 hours it had been picked up by 2 different society columns and a gossip blog that covered the lives of wealthy Virginia families with the invasive enthusiasm of a species that had evolved specifically to do that work. The headline on the gossip blog was, Who was the mystery woman sharing Thanksgiving with Virginia's most eligible bachelor? There was a photograph. There was her name, Kelly Marsh, waitress, Denton Falls. There was speculation, the kind that was designed to sound like information. Callie found out about it from Carol, her mother's friend, who came to the door at 7 in the morning, holding her phone with the expression of someone who has just encountered something they do not know what to do with. Callie read the article. She sat with it for a while. Then she called Marcus. He answered on the second ring and said, "I know. I'm sorry. I've had my publicist send a message to the blog." She said, "That's going to make it worse." He said, "I know, but I couldn't do nothing." She said, "How do you handle this normally?" He said, "Normally there's nothing to handle. Normally the women in these situations are in this world already, and they know how it works, and they have their own publicists." She said, "I don't have a publicist, Marcus." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm going to have people looking at me at work tonight." He said, "I know. I'm sorry." She said, "Stop apologizing." He said, "What would you like me to do instead?" She thought about it. She said, "Tell me this is not going to become a regular thing." He said, "I can't promise that. I wish I could." She said, "Tell me you're not embarrassed." He said, "Callie." He said it with such directness that she stopped. He said, "You walked 94 miles in broken shoes to do something most people would not do. You are the bravest and most decent person I have ever met. I am not embarrassed. I am the opposite of embarrassed." She was quiet. He said, "I am aware that my world is complicated and that the complication is not fair to you, and I am aware that you did not sign up for it. I am asking you to tell me if it's too much." She said, "It's not too much." She said, "Yet." He said, "Yet." She said, "I'm going to go work tonight, and I'm going to do my job. And if anyone says anything to me about a gossip blog, I'm going to tell them I don't comment on things I didn't write. And then I'm going to pour their coffee." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you're going to remember that I'm not a story." He said, "You are not a story." She said, "Good." He said, "Callie." She said, "Yes." He said, "I need to tell you something." She said, "Okay." He said, "I need you to know that what I feel about this, about you, is not what I expected to feel, and it is not what I know how to handle. And I am aware that I am in territory I have never been in before." She said, "I know." He said, "I just need that to be said. I don't need you to respond to it. I just need it to be in the air between us as a true thing." She said, "It is." She said, "It's in the air." He said, "Okay." She said, "I have to get ready for work." He said, "I'll call after 2. She said, "I'll be here." It was December 14th when he drove to Denton Falls without calling first. He had never done that before. He had always called, always confirmed, always respected the time and the rhythm of her life, which was something she had told him early on was important to her, that her time was her own, that she needed to know her life was still hers even in the middle of whatever this was. But on December 14th, he drove to Denton Falls in the middle of the afternoon, and he knocked on the door of the white clapper house on Aldine Road. She opened the door. She was in her off-work clothes, which were just jeans and a sweater, her hair down, a dish towel in her hand. She said, "What happened?" He said, "Nothing bad." She said, "Then why are you here unannounced?" He said, "Because I have something to ask you, and I didn't want to ask it on the phone." She looked at him. She stepped back from the door. He came inside. The house was everything it looked like from the outside. Small, carefully kept. The furniture worn but arranged with obvious thought. The walls hung with few framed photographs and one original drawing, charcoal, a landscape that Callie had done herself years ago that she kept because her mother had loved it. He stood in her front room and looked around it. She said, "Okay." He said, "I want you to come to Charlottesville." She said, "For what?" He said, "For a weekend, to see where I live. Because you've been here 4 times now and I've been here 7. And every time I'm here, I know you a little better. And I think it's time you knew something about my life too." She said, "I'm not coming to this state." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because you in this state is a different person than you in this kitchen at 2 in the morning, and I need some more time with the kitchen version before I meet the state version." He said, "I own a regular house in Charlottesville proper, not the estate. The estate is for business." She said, "A regular house." He said, "Regular is relative, but it has a normal kitchen, and a couch and a TV, and it is where I actually live. She said, you have a regular house. He said, did you think I lived in the manor? She said, I assumed. He said, it would be like living in a convention center. She almost smiled. She said, okay. She said, a weekend? He said, yes. She said, I'll have to trade shifts. He said, I know. She said, I'm not staying in this state. He said, the regular house. She said, and I want to pay for my own train ticket. He said, there is no train between here and Charlottesville. She said, then the bus. He said, the bus takes 3 hours and has one stop. She said, then the bus. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, all right. She said, don't look at me like that. He said, like, what? She said, like you think it's unnecessary. He said, I think it's very you. That's not the same thing as unnecessary. She said, December 21st. He said, I'll be there. She said, at the regular house. He said, at the regular house. She said, with a normal kitchen. He said, I'll make eggs. She said, good. He started toward the door. She said, Marcus. He turned. She said, you drove 4 hours to ask me that. You could have called. He said, I know. She said, so why? He looked at her. He said, because I wanted to see your face when I asked. She looked at him. He said, I wanted to see if it was the good kind of something or the scary kind. She said, both. He said, I'll take both. He left. She stood in the front room of her 3-room house with the dish towel in her hand, and she thought about the watch and the walk and the party, and the broken shoes and the eggs in the morning, and the 2 pies in Tommy Briggs's face, and the phone calls at 2 in the morning, and the way he said her name like he was placing it somewhere. And she thought about her mother, who had told her to keep her feet on the ground and her heart open and see what happens. She looked down at the sneakers she was wearing, the ones in the closet at Hartwell Manor. She was still wearing them. She looked over at the mantelpiece where she had put the old shoes, the broken ones, the ones with the electrical tape, and the cracked sole and the newspaper stuff in the toe. She had cleaned them and set them there the day she got home. She did not know yet exactly why, but they belonged somewhere she could see them. December 21st. The bus arrived in Charlottesville at noon. He was waiting at the station, not in a suit, in jeans and jacket, leaning against a regular car, not the car he had driven her home in, a simpler one, a sedan, dark blue, nothing remarkable. She came out of the station with her bag. She saw him, and she stopped for a fraction of a second, and then she kept walking toward him. He said, good trip? She said, the bus had a stop in Waynesboro for 20 minutes. An older woman got on and sat next to me and told me her whole life story. He said, was it a good one? She said, it was wonderful. She'd been married to the same man for 51 years. She was going to see her grandchildren. He said, did she ask about you? She said, she asked if I was going to see someone special. He said, what did you say? She said, I said I thought so. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, come on, I'll make lunch. The regular house was on a street in Charlottesville that had old trees and sidewalks and neighbors who had lived there for decades. It was a brick house, 2 stories, with a front porch and a yard that needed attention but had good bones. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at it. She said, this is yours. He said, this is mine. She said, it looks like someone lives here. He said, I live here. She said, I mean it looks like a real person lives here, with a life. He said, I try. He opened the front door. Inside it was warm, and there were books on shelves and a couch that had a dent in one cushion from regular use, and a kitchen with realware on the counter, and through the window a garden that was dormant for winter, but was clearly someone's genuine project. She walked through the rooms. He let her. He went to the kitchen and started making lunch. She came and stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched him for a moment. She said, you actually live here. He said, I actually live here. She said, I didn't fully believe it until right now. He said, what did you think? She said, I thought there might be a version of you that was real and a version that was a party, and they might be more even than you let on. He said, and now? She said, now I think the party version is a performance, and this is the person. He said, yes. She said, then who is the party version for? He said, for the people who need to see it, for the business and the board and the world that those things require. She said, do you like it? He said, I used to. She said, and now? He said, now it feels like a coat I put on. It fits fine, but it's not warm. She looked at him. She said, the coat fits fine. He said, that's not as sad as it sounds. She said, it's a little sad. He said, maybe. He said, a little. He made her lunch. They sat at the kitchen table in the regular house in the December light and ate together and talked the way they had been talking for 2 months, without performance, without agenda, with the full weight of two people who had decided that honesty is the only thing that makes the distance worth crossing. The afternoon, they walked in the garden. It was cold enough for coats, but not for misery. The particular clear cold of Virginia December that smells like with smoke and bare earth. He had work to do in the garden. He said, small things, winter cleanup, covering some things over, and she said she would help. And they worked side by side in the cold garden for 2 hours, talking and not talking in the comfortable rhythm of two people who no longer need to fill silence to keep each other's company. At some point, she found a flat stone under the overgrown section at the back of the garden and turned it over. There was an inscription on the underside, not elaborate, just a name and a date. She looked at it. She said, Marcus. He came over. He looked at the stone. He was quiet for a moment. He said, my mother planted this garden. She said, oh, he said, she had it exactly the way she wanted it, every spring. And when she died, I didn't know how to keep it right. So I just let it go and it got away from me, and now I try to keep up at the edges of it, but I haven't really gone into the middle in a long time. She looked at the overgrown section. She said, what did she plant in the middle? He said, I don't remember all of it. Roses, I know. Some kind of climbing thing on that trellis. A lot of things that come back on their own if you leave them. She said, they're still there. He said, probably. She said, under all this. He said, yes. She said, we should find them. He looked at her. He said, it's December. She said, I know. I'm not saying dig. I'm saying next spring. Come back and look. See what came back. He said, next spring. She said, yes. He said, you're making plans for next spring. She said, I'm suggesting a plan for next spring. It's not the same thing. He said, Callie. She said, yes. He said, I'd like it to be the same thing. She looked at him. The garden was quiet around them. The winter light was going thin and gold over the rooftops. She said, we talked about this. Not rushing. He said, I'm not rushing. I'm saying that when I think about next spring, you're in it, and I think you should know that. She said, it's been 2 months. He said, yes. She said, you've known me for 2 months. He said, I've known you since the night I woke up in a diner booth with my hand in yours. That was 14 months ago. She was quiet. He said, I know you're careful. I know why you're careful. I know the distance and the difference and all the reasons this requires care. I'm not asking you to stop being careful. He said, I'm just telling you the truth. That's all. I'm putting a true thing in the air between us. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she bent down and very carefully lifted the flat stone from where it was and turned it right side up and set it back where it had been, name up, facing the sky. He watched her. She stood up. She said, next spring. She said, we'll come look. He said, okay. She said, and Marcus. He said, yes. She said, I know. He said, you know what? She said, the true thing you put in the air. I know. He looked at her. She looked back at him, in the cold December garden, with the stone turned right side up and the bare trees overhead and the smell of winter and with smoke around them. Two people stood in particular silence that happens just after something true and large has been acknowledged between them. Then she said, it's cold. Let's go in. He said, yes. They went in. Christmas came. He asked her to come back for Christmas. She said, I have people here. He said, bring them. She said, you cannot invite Patty and Gerald and Carol and Tommy Briggs to your house for Christmas. He said, I absolutely can. She said, you don't know what you're saying. He said, I have a house big enough for a gathering, and I know how to cook eggs, and I have a car, and Gerald makes apple pie, and I think Tommy Briggs is probably good company, and Patty sounds like a woman I would like to meet properly. She was quiet. He said, please. She said, they'll be overwhelmed. He said, buy a brick house with a worn couch. She said, they'll know what you are. He said, they already know what I am. What they don't know is who I am when I'm in my kitchen with people who matter. She said, they matter. He said, I know. That's why I want them to see. She thought about it. She called Patty. Patty said, well, it's about time. She called Gerald and Diane. Diane said yes before Gerald finished asking her. She called Carol. Carol cried a little. She called Tommy Briggs. Tommy said, that man saved my trucks. Of course I'm coming. She called Marcus. She said, 6 people including me. Patty needs a chair with arms because of her back. Gerald is bringing apple pie, and if you say anything to diminish the apple pie, I will leave immediately. He said, I would never diminish the apple pie. She said, good. She said, and Marcus? He said, yes. She said, James. He said, what about James? She said, invite James. Invite him, and whatever and whoever his life is. Invite him. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I hadn't thought of that. She said, I know. He said, why? She said, because you've been separate for so long you've forgotten that separate isn't the only option. Because Christmas is the right time to stop being separate. Because the workshop in Staunton is 30 miles away, and that is a 30-minute drive, and there is no reason at all for your brother to be there, and you to be here on the same holiday. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, his name is James, and he has a dog named Frank, and he's proud to bring something he made with his hands as a gift, because that's who he is. She said, I hope so. He said, you've never met him. She said, no, but I know he's your brother, and you've missed him for a long time, and I would like to meet the person whose approval my friend Tommy's trucks were partly responsible for earning. He said, friend Tommy. She said, he's my friend Tommy now. He's been my friend Tommy since he came to my mother's funeral. He said, Callie. She said, yes. He said, I love you. Silence. Not the party silence. Not the room-going quiet silence. The silence of something that had been building for 2 months and had just found its words, sitting in the air of a phone call in a December kitchen. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, I know. He said, that's not a response. She said, yes, it is. It's an honest one. He said, okay. He said, I'll wait. She said, you shouldn't have to wait. He said, I don't mind. She said, Marcus. He said, yes. She said, when I know, you'll know. He said, all right. She said, invite your brother. He said, I'll call him tonight. She said, good. Christmas at the brick house was the kind of day that becomes a reference point. The kind of day that people refer back to for years, not because anything extraordinary happened, but because everything ordinary happened exactly right, the way it sometimes does when the right people are in the same room with enough warmth and food and goodwill and time. James came with his dog Frank, who was a large and undisciplined brown dog with enormous affection for everyone and no concept of personal space, and who immediately lay down on Patty's feet, which Patty responded by scratching his ears and feeding him small pieces of ham for the remainder of the day. James was tall like his brother, but different in the way of siblings who share a source but grew in different directions. Quieter, more contained. The kind of man who watches everything for a long time before he says anything. And when he says it, it lands with the weight of something he has actually thought about. He brought a cutting board. He had made it himself, maple and cherry wood, end grain, the kind that will last 50 years, and he had made it for Callie without having met her yet, because Marcus had described her, apparently, in enough detail that James had formed a clear enough picture to know what to make. He handed it to her at the door. He said, Marcus told me you like to cook. She said, I do. He said, that should hold up for you. She turned it over in her hands. She said, it's beautiful. He said, I'm glad. She said, you're exactly like your brother. He looked at her. He said, nobody says that. She said, you both put true things in the air between you and people, and then wait to see what they do with it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I was going to form an opinion of you before I got here today. She said, and he said, you ruined my plan in about 30 seconds. She said, is that good? He said, yes. He said, thank you for telling him to call me. She said, I didn't tell him to. I suggested. He said, there's no difference with Marcus. She looked at him. She said, there kind of is, but I'll take it. He smiled. Marcus, watching from across the room, felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a very long time. Dinner was loud and good. Gerald held court in the kitchen for a portion of it. which the kitchen allowed because it was, as promised, a normal kitchen with room for a large cook who had opinions about timing. Patty sat at the head of the table because she was the oldest, and she made clear within 10 minutes of arriving that she intended to be the most comfortable person in the room, and she was. Tommy, Briggs, and James talked for almost an hour about wood, specifically about the kind of wood used in fire apparatus interior fittings, which Marcus had not imagined was a topic, but which turned out to have real depth. Carol talked with Marcus about Callie's mother, because Carol had known her mother for 30 years, and Marcus listened with the attention of someone learning the origin story of something essential. Callie moved through the day the way she moved through everything, with full presence and very little noise, making sure everyone had what they needed, not because she was serving them, but because caring for people in front of her was as automatic to her as breathing. Late in the afternoon, when the dishes were mostly done and the dog was asleep on Patty's feet, and James and Tommy had moved their conversation to the porch with cups of coffee, Marcus found Callie in the kitchen finishing the last of the dishes. He stood beside her. He took a dish towel. They did the last few things without talking. Then he said, "Thank you." She said, "For what?" He said, "All of it. The watch, the walk, the phone call about James. Today, all of it." She said, "I didn't do it for you." He said, "I know. That's part of why I'm thanking you." She looked at him. He was very close. The kitchen was quiet except for the small sounds of the party winding down in the other rooms. She said, "Marcus." He said, "Yes." She said, "I love you too." He was very still. She said it simply, looking at him. No performance, no dramatics, the same directness she brought to everything. This woman who had walked 94 miles in broken shoes and cleaned gravel out of a stranger's hand and kept a promise to her mother every single day for 4 years and lay awake at night, knowing when something was not right and not resting until it was. He said, "I know." She looked at him. He said, "That's not a response." She said, "Yes, it is. It's an honest one." She handed him the last dish. He took it. He was smiling. The real one. The one connected to something actually happening inside him. She said, "Dry that. The others are waiting." He dried it. He put away. They went back to the others. Spring came the way spring comes to Virginia. Not all at once, but in accumulation. Warm days earning more warm days. The ground making its decisions underground before the surface shows anything. They came back to the brick house on the second weekend of April. The garden was awake. Not all of it and not tidily, but here and there in the overgrown middle section. Things were coming up that had been there all along, waiting under the frozen ground and the dead leaves and the years of inattention, making their quiet decision to try again. She found the roses, not blooming yet, but there, the canes showing green at the tips, the shape of them coming back to the tangle, the climbing thing on the trellis, showing new growth along the old frame like lace. She said, "Look." He came and looked. He said, "They came back." She said, "They were always there." He said, "I know." She said, "You just had to look." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his shoulder in the April garden, and they looked at what had come back after everything, all the years and the loss and the silence and the distance and the overgrowth. Still there, still coming back. On a morning in May, she walked into Patty's diner for the last time as an employee. This was her choice. She had made it slowly, over months, turning it over the way she turned over everything that mattered, looking at it from every angle, making sure she was sure, making sure she was moving toward something rather than away from it, making sure she was not abandoning anything she actually needed to keep. She had been accepted to a nursing program at the University of Virginia. It had been her mother's wish for her, quietly held for years, something her mother had said once and not pushed but said with enough weight that Callie had kept in the archive of her heart all this time. Her mother had said, "You have the hand for it, baby. You clean gravel out of strangers' hands at midnight, and you never flinch. You could do more with hands like that." She had applied in January. She had not told Marcus until she got the acceptance letter. When she told him, he had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said, "When do you start?" She said, "September." He said, "Where are you going to live?" She said, "I don't know yet. I'm looking at apartments." He said, "The brick house." She said, "Marcus." He said, "The brick house has 3 extra rooms and Charlottesville has a University of Virginia nursing program, and I don't know why we're talking about apartments." She said, "I need to be clear about something." He said, "Okay." She said, I'm going to nursing school because it's what I want, not because of you, not because of your money or your world or any of the things that being with you could make possible. He said, I know. She said, in the brick house. He said, yes. She said, if I live in the brick house, I'm contributing equally, whatever I have. He said, I make more in a week than you make in a year. She said, I know. She said, I'm not saying equal in the dollar sense. I'm saying equal in the sense of this is mine, as much as it's yours while I'm in it. He said, yes, absolutely yes. She said, and if it becomes something it shouldn't be, if I start to lose myself in your world, I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to need you to hear it. He said, I will hear it. She said, promise me. He said, I promise you. I will hear it every time. I will never use what I have to drown out what you say. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, okay. She said, the brick house. He said, the brick house. Her last shift at Patty's Diner was on a Thursday night in late May. Patty closed the diner at midnight, which she never did, and locked the door, and she and Gerald and Diane and Callie sat in booth 4 and ate the apple pie and drank the coffee and talked until 2 in the morning. Patty said, you were the best late shift waitress I ever had. Callie said, I know. Patty said, don't get too good at nursing school to come back and eat here. Callie said, I could never. Gerald said nothing for most of the night, but when Callie stood up to leave, he put his arms around her, this large, quiet man who had made apple pie in the same kitchen for 31 years, and held on for a moment, and she felt the weight of it and held on too. She drove herself out of Denton Falls the next morning in a car she had bought used, saved for, paid cash for, a car that was 8 years old and had a small dent in the back bumper and got good gas mileage. And she drove the 4 hours to Charlottesville with her things in the trunk and her mother's paperback on the seat beside her. And she pulled up in front of the brick house, and Marcus was on the porch, and the garden behind him was beginning to bloom. She got out of the car. She looked at the house. She looked at him. She said, I brought my own dishes. He said, good. She said, in my mother's chair. The green one. It's in the trunk. He said, it'll go in the front room. She said, yes. He came down off the porch. He took the first box from the trunk. She took the second. They carried them inside into the brick house, into the warm rooms, into the life that was being built the way good things are built, slowly and deliberately and with both people's hands on it from the very beginning. The old broken shoes were in the last box she brought in. She had wrapped them in a cloth, and they rolled in the box with her mother's paperback and the original charcoal drawing, and the small worn photograph of her mother on the porch of the 3-room house in Denton Falls. She unwrapped them. She put them on the mantelpiece. Marcus came and stood beside her. He said, those are going on the mantelpiece. She said, yes. He said, because... She said, because everything that matters started with them. He looked at them. He said, they carried you 94 miles. She said, they carried me to you. He said nothing. He put his arm around her. She leaned into his shoulder. The garden outside was blooming. The roses coming back, the climbing thing alive on the trellis, everything returning that had been waiting to return. The shoes sat on the mantelpiece in the afternoon light, cracked and worn, and exactly themselves, holding the whole story. There's a thing about walking that people who have only ever driven do not know. When you walk somewhere, you know the ground between you and where you are going. You know every mile of it. You know where it is flat and where it rises. You know where the road turns. You know what the air smells like at different points along the way. You know where you were when you were tired enough to wonder if you would make it and what you told yourself to keep going. You cannot get that knowledge any other way. You cannot buy it or borrow it or be driven through it and pick it up. You have to walk it. Callie Marsh had walked 94 miles in broken shoes to return something that was not hers. She had walked it through cold mornings and sore feet, and the particular loneliness of a long road with no one else on it. She had walked it past farmhouses where lights came on at 5 in the morning, and past fields going gold in the early October light, and past the long stretches where there was nothing but the road and the sky, and her own feet finding the next step. She had carried her mother's voice with her the whole way. Keep being good, baby. The world needs it more than you know. And the world had, in the end, returned the favor. Not with money, though she would earn her own. Not with ease, though things had gotten easier, with a brick house where the garden bloomed, and a man who had learned to hear her, and a brother repaired, and a fire captain's truck still running, and a nursing program starting in September, and a kitchen where eggs were made with care, and a couch with a dent in the cushion, and a mantelpiece where the shoes sat in the light. The world had returned the favor with a life. Her life, still hers, more hers than before. She had kept her feet on the ground and her heart open. She had kept the promise. She had found out what happens. If you have watched this story all the way to the end, then you know something now that you did not know before about the weight of the small right thing, about the distance a person will walk when they have decided who they are going to be, about the way goodness, the quiet, ordinary, unglamorous, no audience kind, has a way of finding its way back to the person who put it into the world. Not always in the way they expected, but always in full. There's a woman somewhere right now doing the hard right thing with no one watching. There's a man somewhere right now sitting with a phone in his hand, trying to figure out if sorry is enough. There's a pair of broken shoes somewhere that has carried someone further than anyone will ever know. This story is for all of them. If it moved you, if some part of it reached a place where you keep the things that matter, please share it with someone who needs it tonight. And subscribe, because this channel exists for stories exactly like this one. And there are more of them, and they are waiting for you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying. Keep being good. The world needs it more than you know.